Located in Boston is the Granary Cemetery. It dates back to about 1690 and has at least 2,300 tombstones, but may house as much as 5 times as many dead bodies. Now, many of the deceased here are historically famous and names that you'll hear in class, but I want to show you that there's also many other people in here, and sadly many children, as you see this 4-year-old's grave. The first historical figures we'll look at is James Otis of Massachusetts, born in 1725. Now, he was one of the first, most outspoken patriots, spoke a lot against the writs of assistance, and remind me to tell you the story of what happened to him in a cane. Now, this obelisk marks the grave of John Hancock. You might know him as the first to sign the Declaration of Independence, and signing it so largely that the king would see it without his glasses. Now, oddly enough, he is there without a hand. I'll tell you about that story. Also note that his servant Frank, which most likely means slave, is buried next to him. Now, slaves in the South usually had their own segregated cemeteries, but not here in the Granary Cemetery. Now, a famous former slave who did receive freedom also is here, and that's of Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American author of a published book of poetry. Tried so hard to find where her grave was, but did not have luck, but rest be assured it is in here somewhere. Now, I'm sure you all recognize the name Paul Revere, whose tomb is here. He did so much more than just ride the horse, warning people that the British were coming, and we'll talk about that. And also here you have the family grave area of Benjamin Franklin's family, his parents and other members. Remember, we think of him as Philadelphia, but he did spend his youth in Boston, where his family was from. One of the leading patriots, Sam Adams. Please don't just think of Sam Adams as a guy who brewed beer. There's some truth to that, but there's a lot more to this story. My main reason for going was to see the grave of the people from the Boston Massacre. So here's the remains of Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, Patrick Carr, as well as the child Christopher Seider, who was killed in February 22nd of 1770. Now, I wanted to read you part of a book about the death of Christopher Seider. So I came back to the cemetery the next day at 7 in the morning when no other people would be there, so I could read this for you. Here we go. And of course, I should add, it's from the book Cradle of Violence, Boston's Waterfront Mobs and the American Revolution by Russell Bourne.
About a month after the dispute between Quincy and Molyneux, on February 22nd, a large crowd of men and boys were surrounding an importer shop, preventing any customers from entering. Ebenezer Richardson, the importer's neighbor, stepped in to see what he could do. The Boston Sons of Liberty despised Richardson as a customs informer, and the feeling was mutual. Richardson tried to knock down an offensive sign posted in front of his neighbor's shop. He got into a verbal argument with a few of the protesters, including the Lebanon importer, Edward Proctor. Proctor and the other protesters followed Richardson to his house, and the boys followed, throwing fruit rinds and eggs, sticks and stones. Eventually, the hecklers goaded Richardson so far that he aimed his musket out the window and fired a charge of swan shot, or pea-sized pellets, into the crowd. 11-year-old Christopher Seider, stooping to pick up a rock, was hit with 11 pellets. 2 more hit 19-year-old Samuel Gore. One injured 2 of the fingers on his right hand, and another lodged itself in his thigh. Dr. Joseph Warren, a Harvard graduate and a member of the local Masonic Lodge, treated the wounded young man. Gore healed sufficiently for him to help hoist tea chests with the destroyers 3 years later. But little Seider's wounds turned out to be fatal. As the crowd roared with grief and rage, Molyneux was barely able to stop them from stringing Richardson up. And he wasn't hung. He was put to jail. So despite Dr. Warren's attempts, poor Christopher Seider did die, and supposedly in the arms of his mother. He became almost a martyr, if you will. People really rallied behind him and his death. Reports are that when they had a funeral for him, it was like the largest funeral that was ever in America. Hundreds of teenage boys and young boys from Boston marched in rows. All sorts of people were in the funeral procession and attended it. So it's a name you probably haven't really heard of, but it was a really big impetus for what really got the revolution going, because people were rightly mad about it.
So I was walking just a few short minutes from the cemetery through a block or two into Boston Commons, where you do see there is this memorial for the 5 victims of what is known as the Boston Massacre. You see a lot of symbolism with the obelisk and the statue. It seemed fitting to take you from this cemetery and the memorial to the actual site of the Boston Massacre. I found this place to be very moving, especially with the sound of the bagpipes. So pause and reflect on this site as we end our tour today.